It was a rare afternoon when Chris decided to leave work early. His usual routine was to stay late, buried in paperwork, trying to make his small insurance brokerage firm thrive. The weight of his responsibilities often left little time for his family. He thought Lena, his wife of 18 years, would understand. But that day, something gnawed at him. A growing sense of unease had taken root in his chest in the last few weeks. Something in the air felt different. And so he drove home earlier than usual, intending to surprise her. The house was quiet when he pulled into the driveway. There was no sound of laughter, no distant music from the living room. The kids were at school, and it should have been just the two of them. The door to the garage creaked open as he approached, and he froze. Lena's voice reached him first. "What are you doing here?" He blinked, his heart stumbling in his chest. His wife of nearly 2 decades stood in the doorway of their garage, her body partially blocking the younger man beside her. Chris's eyes flitted between them, taking in the awkward tension, the unease on their faces. Lena was stunning, as always. Her auburn hair framed her face, and the curve of her body was still a vision of grace and elegance. She wore a white blouse, but Chris couldn't help but notice the extra button undone, revealing just enough skin for his mind to race. His gaze shifted to the man beside her, Ryan Foster, a much younger man he had never seen before. His appearance was polished, confident, a stark contrast to Chris's own weathered demeanor after years of grinding away at work. The stranger's expression carried traces of guilt and concern, and for a moment Chris swore he saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "I live here," Chris replied, his voice edged with an irritation he hadn't expected to feel. He stood there, feeling the cold air between him and Lena, her gaze darting nervously from him to Ryan. "Of course you do," she said quickly, her voice betraying a slight edge of panic. "But why are you home so early? I thought you had a meeting with the board." She gave an exaggerated laugh, trying to cover the tension in the air. Chris raised an eyebrow. Her defense was weak, too quick. Why had she lied? He was accustomed to Lena's meticulous planning, the way she always stayed a few steps ahead of any confrontation. But now, the cracks in her usual composure were glaring. He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes narrowing on the pair. "And what about him?" He gestured toward Ryan, his voice laced with a calmness that belied the storm building inside him. "What exactly are you two doing?" Lena looked at Ryan, then back at Chris, her expression faltering. "Chris, this is Ryan. He's an old friend from work. We've been catching up." The words stung like salt in an open wound. An old friend. The lie tasted bitter. There was more to this. He could feel it. His gut screamed at him to dig deeper, but his heart felt like it was being torn in two. For years he'd told himself their marriage was strong. They had built this life together, through ups and downs, the sacrifices, the late nights, the children who had grown up in this home. But the pieces weren't fitting anymore. His gaze fell to the young man standing beside Lena. Ryan didn't meet his eyes. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably on his feet, like a man who had been caught in the act. Something clicked in Chris's mind, the subtle signs of guilt, the way Ryan avoided eye contact. The lies were coming fast now, and Chris was no longer sure who he was supposed to trust. Was this some misunderstanding, or had it all been a carefully crafted illusion? Chris's heart began to race as his mind spun, calculating every scenario. What was he supposed to do now? His instincts told him that something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't yet piece it all together. This moment, this sudden confrontation, felt unreal. He wanted to confront Lena, to demand the truth, but the words were stuck in his throat. Before he could respond, Lena cleared her throat, her voice dropping to a softer, more familiar tone. "Chris, why don't we talk inside? We have some things we need to discuss." Chris's eyes hardened, a bitter chuckle escaping his lips. Talk? There was no more talking. Not yet. Not until he understood what was happening. He took a deep breath, trying to hold on to his composure as everything in him screamed for action. "I don't think there's much left to talk about," he muttered, his eyes shifting between them, a wave of anger starting to well up inside him. How had he been so blind for so long? His voice was low, steady, but every word felt like it was being spoken through gritted teeth. "So why don't you both explain to me exactly what's going on here?" His eyes bore into Lena's, demanding the truth she was so desperately trying to hide. Lena swallowed, her gaze dropping. Ryan shifted awkwardly on his feet, then finally looked up at Chris, offering a weak, uncomfortable smile. "Mr. Harrington, Don't," Chris interrupted, his voice firm. "Just don't. I think I've heard enough." His words hung in the air, thick with tension. Lena's eyes flickered with something. Was it regret? Chris couldn't tell. All he knew was the stark realization settling in. Everything he thought he knew, everything he had worked for was slipping away. The foundation of his life, his marriage, was crumbling before his eyes. The man who had always prided himself on keeping his family safe, on being a provider, now stood at a crossroads. His heart ached, his mind raced, but somewhere deep down, he knew that this moment, this discovery, would mark the beginning of something bigger. Something he wasn't ready for, but would have to face. The silence that followed Chris's confrontation with Lena felt like an eternity. He stood there, staring at his wife, her face flushed, her eyes avoiding his. Ryan, awkward and tense, had all but vanished into the background, as though he too was afraid to meet Chris's gaze. The weight of the moment pressed down on Chris's chest, his mind a swirl of confusion, anger, and disbelief. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him. Everything he'd worked for, the family he'd built, the trust he'd placed in Lena, all of it felt like a lie. But no matter how much his heart screamed for answers, he knew he couldn't act on impulse. He needed the truth, not more secrets. The only way to move forward was to get to the bottom of it all. That night, after the house fell quiet and Lena retreated to their bedroom, Chris lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. How had it all come to this? Was he so blind, so caught up in his work that he missed the signs? But more than that, how long had Lena been hiding this from him? His stomach churned with every thought. The next morning, Chris made a decision. He would take control. He wasn't going to wait around for Lena to admit more or for Ryan to offer a half-hearted apology. He was going to uncover everything. He needed to know the full truth, even if it meant confronting the harshest realities. He called David Alvarez, a private investigator he'd worked with on a few cases for his clients. David was calm, professional, and, most importantly, discreet. Chris could barely get the words out as he explained his situation, but David understood immediately. "I'll start today," David said, his voice steady. "I'll get the details you need, but you'll need to be prepared for whatever we find." That afternoon, as Chris waited for the first report, he couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at him. Every time he passed Lena in the house, he could feel her eyes on him, guilty yet silent, like a prisoner awaiting judgment. She didn't offer an explanation, didn't try to apologize, and certainly didn't ask for forgiveness. Chris couldn't bring himself to confront her again, not yet. Not until he knew the full story, and he would get that story, no matter the cost. By the following day, David had already begun his investigation. The first piece of the puzzle arrived in the form of a photo. David had followed Lena and Ryan to a cafe near Hartford, one that Chris knew well from their early days together. The photo showed Lena and Ryan sitting at a corner table, their bodies leaning into each other as they spoke. The image wasn't intimate in the physical sense, but the closeness was undeniable. Chris's heart sank. The emotional connection, that was what had hit him the hardest. It wasn't just about sex, it was about Lena turning to someone else for what she should have been turning to him for. The betrayal ran deeper than he had imagined. David's next report was even more troubling. Over the next few weeks, David had tracked Lena and Ryan's movements, piecing together their secret meetings and stolen moments. They had spent entire afternoons together, meeting at hotels when Lena was supposed to be working. They had even shared a romantic getaway to a cabin in the woods, a place Chris and Lena had visited once for their anniversary. The physical part of the affair, Chris realized, was just the surface. This was about much more than that. It was about Lena's emotional neediness, her need for validation, and Ryan's manipulation. When Chris received the final report, he felt a chill run down his spine. Lena had been seeing Ryan for almost a year. Their relationship had started innocently, as Lena had said, but over time it had escalated. The affair wasn't just physical, it was a full-blown emotional relationship. They had spent countless hours texting, calling, and meeting in secret. Lena had even confided in Ryan about the growing distance between her and Chris. She had poured her heart out to him, making Ryan her emotional anchor. Chris felt the weight of the betrayal settle over him like a heavy fog. He had been there, providing for his family, working tirelessly to ensure that they had everything they needed. But he had neglected the one thing that mattered most: his relationship with Lena. He had believed that providing for her, taking care of the children, was enough. But now, as he read through the investigators' findings, he realized how little he had truly been there for her emotionally. The truth was clear. Chris had been so consumed with work, so focused on building his career and securing their future, that he had neglected the foundation of their marriage, their emotional connection. And Lena, feeling abandoned, had found solace in Ryan. He wasn't the cause of her actions, but he had become the means by which she sought comfort, and Chris knew deep down that it wasn't just Ryan she had betrayed. Chris sat at his kitchen table, the reports scattered in front of him. He didn't know what hurt more, the affair itself or the realization that he had failed to see the cracks in their marriage. The emotional impact hit him harder than the physical betrayal ever could. It wasn't just a woman cheating on her husband. It was the erosion of trust, the loss of intimacy, the breaking of something that had once been whole. But now, with the truth in hand, Chris knew what he had to do next. He had to confront Lena again, but this time it would be different. He had the evidence. He wasn't going to stand by and let her continue to deceive him. He would demand accountability, not just for the affair, but for the emotional neglect that had led them both to this point. The next morning, Chris found himself standing in the same kitchen where, just a few weeks ago, he had shared morning coffees with Lena, the two of them laughing over mundane details of their day. Now, the kitchen felt foreign, the familiar hum of the coffee machine seeming louder, more oppressive, as if mocking the silence between them. His mind raced through the evidence, the photos, the hotel bookings, the phone records. It was all there, clear and undeniable. He had spent the night unable to sleep, replaying every moment in his mind, every word Lena had said, every moment of doubt he had ignored. He had come to a harsh realization. This wasn't just about infidelity. This was about an emotional void that he had allowed to widen between them. He had been so wrapped up in work, in providing for his family, that he had taken Lena's presence for granted. Today, there would be no more running from the truth. He would confront Lena, not as the husband who still harbored hope, but as the man who had finally understood the depth of her betrayal. The storm had come, and now he had to face it head on. He found Lena in their bedroom, staring out of the window, her arms crossed tightly around herself. Her back was to him, and for a moment, Chris thought about turning away, letting her have this last shred of peace. But he couldn't. The weight of the truth pushed him forward, and he spoke, his voice steady, though it trembled with a barely contained fury. "Lena." She didn't turn. "Chris," she replied quietly, her voice shaky, as if she knew what was coming but couldn't bring herself to face it. Chris stepped closer, the evidence in his hand. The thick manila folder felt heavier than ever. He opened it slowly, the papers inside rustling like the last remnants of his hopes for their marriage. "You told me it was nothing," he said, his voice cold, almost detached. "You told me Ryan was just an old friend, but you lied. You've been lying to me for months." Lena flinched at his words, but still, she didn't turn to face him. She remained rooted to the spot, like a woman bracing herself for a storm. "Tell me it's not true, Lena," Chris pressed, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Tell me you weren't seeing him. Tell me this wasn't a secret you've been hiding." She finally turned then, and Chris saw the tears in her eyes. Tears that felt more like a defense than an apology. Lena opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her lips trembled, and for a moment Chris saw her as the woman he had fallen in love with years ago. The woman he had built a life with. The woman who, despite everything, still held a piece of his heart. Chris, I didn't want you to find out like this," Lena whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you." The words, once meant to soothe, only deepened the wound. Chris clenched his fists at his sides, fighting to keep his composure. His chest tightened as he took a step toward her, his gaze unflinching. "You didn't want me to find out?" he echoed bitterly, shaking his head. "You've been lying to me for months, Lena. You've been sharing your life with another man, emotionally and physically, and you think it's something I shouldn't know? You think it was okay to keep this from me?" Lena opened her mouth, but Chris didn't let her speak. His words rushed out in a torrent, fueled by all the rage and heartbreak he had been holding in. "I've given you everything. I worked, I provided, I took care of our family, and you—" He paused, his voice thick with emotion, but he forced the words out. "You couldn't even give me honesty. What's worse is you took the most vulnerable parts of me and shared them with him. I gave you everything, and you took that love and replaced it with a lie." The room seemed to shrink, the air between them charged with unspoken pain. Lena's face contorted as though she was searching for a way to explain herself, but nothing could undo the damage. "I don't know what happened," she said finally, her voice small, barely above a whisper. "We were drifting apart, Chris, and then Ryan was there. He understood me. He made me feel seen, heard." Her voice trailed off, and for the first time Chris saw the full weight of her regret. "I was lonely," she admitted, her voice shaky. "I didn't know how to fix it. I never meant for it to go this far." Loneliness. It was a word Chris had never expected to hear from her. He had been there, in the house, at her side for years. How could she have felt so alone? He fought the rising wave of emotion in his chest, his heart hammering against his ribs. Had he really neglected her that much? Had his focus on work and the demands of providing for their family made her feel this empty? "You were never alone, Lena," Chris said, his voice quiet now, full of pain. "I was right here. I just didn't know how to reach you anymore." Lena's eyes filled with more tears, and she finally stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached out. "Chris, I'm sorry. I was stupid. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you." Chris stepped back, putting distance between them. The apology, the love in her eyes, it wasn't enough anymore. It was too late for apologies. The trust had been shattered, and no matter how much she regretted her actions, the damage had already been done. "Love me," Chris repeated, his voice almost hollow. "Love isn't enough when the truth is a lie." He shook his head, the finality of his words hanging in the air like a heavy curtain. The pain was unbearable, but he knew deep down that it was the only way forward. "I don't know if I can ever believe in us again, Lena." Lena collapsed onto the bed, sobbing. Chris stood still, his heart breaking as he watched her. He wanted to comfort her, wanted to hold her and tell her everything would be okay. But he couldn't, not after everything that had happened. For the first time in years, he understood what it truly meant to be alone. But now, in this moment, he was the one who had to find his way out of the darkness. The morning after the confrontation, Chris felt like a man walking through the ashes of his own life. He had hoped for clarity, some sign that things could be fixed, but all he saw was the broken fragments of his marriage scattered around him. Lena had apologized, had cried, had begged for his forgiveness. But Chris knew deep down that this wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about control. The control that had been taken from him, bit by bit, over the months of betrayal. Chris could no longer afford to be the passive husband who had been blind to the cracks in his relationship. If there was one thing he could take charge of now, it was the aftermath of this catastrophe. He had to face it with clear eyes, a sharp mind, and a strategy. After another sleepless night, Chris made a decision. He needed to take action, not just emotionally, but practically. The first step was to seek legal advice. He called Catherine Daniels, a divorce attorney with a reputation for handling complex cases, especially those involving infidelity. Catherine had a sharp mind, and Chris needed someone who would see through the fog of emotions and get to the heart of the matter. The meeting was set for the next afternoon. Sitting across from Catherine in her sleek, modern office, Chris felt like a man on trial. He stared down at the desk, his hands tightly gripping the armrests of the chair. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being the man who could provide, protect, and lead his family. Now, He felt powerless. Catherine, however, was unfazed. She leaned forward, her eyes piercing, as she asked the question that Chris had been avoiding all day. "Why do you want a divorce, Chris?" The question hit him like a freight train. For the first time, he had to vocalize the pain that had been churning inside him. He took a deep breath, and with an exhale that felt like the release of years of tension, he spoke. "I want it because I was betrayed," Chris said, his voice quiet but firm. "Lena cheated on me. I can't go back to that. I don't know if I can trust her again." He paused, feeling the weight of his own words. "But it's not just that. She emotionally abandoned me. I neglected our marriage. I worked too much, and I didn't pay attention to what she needed. And now, I have to fix this for me, for my kids." Catherine nodded, taking notes, but her eyes never left his. She had heard countless stories of infidelity, but Chris's was different. His pain wasn't just about the affair. It was about realizing how much he had taken his wife for granted, how much he had allowed the distance to grow between them. "We can proceed with the divorce on grounds of adultery," Catherine said, her tone professional yet sympathetic. "But there are other considerations: assets, custody of the children, and the emotional fallout. You need to be prepared for a long battle, Chris. Your wife won't go down without a fight, especially when she has someone like Ryan involved." Chris clenched his jaw. He knew she was right. Lena would fight tooth and nail, not just for the marriage, but for the life she had built with him. He wasn't sure what she wanted anymore, but he was done pretending he could fix something that was already broken. As the meeting ended, Catherine provided Chris with a list of steps to take. She advised him to gather all evidence of Lena's affair, from texts and photos to financial records that might show their secretive spending. Chris was to prepare for a long and emotional process, but more importantly, he had to focus on his children's well-being. Custody battles, in particular, could get ugly. Walking out of Catherine's office, Chris felt a shift within himself. For the first time since the affair came to light, he felt like he had some control over the situation. He wasn't just reacting to Lena's betrayal. He was actively taking steps to protect his future, his children's future, and his peace of mind. But he knew the emotional battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Later that night, after putting the kids to bed, Chris sat down in front of his laptop, scrolling through the evidence David had provided. Photos, hotel receipts, and detailed timelines. The reality of Lena's betrayal was laid out before him in stark black and white. The affair wasn't just a few stolen moments. It was a calculated, ongoing relationship, and Chris was left standing on the outside, watching as his life crumbled. It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the realization that Lena had never given him the full picture. She had kept so much from him: emotions, doubts, desires. All of it had been hidden behind a veil of half-truths. The trust was gone, and there was no way to get it back. Not now, not after everything. But Chris wasn't about to let her manipulate him into staying. He wasn't going to be the victim of her emotional games anymore. He wasn't going to sit by and let Ryan take what he had worked so hard for, what he had built for his family. Chris turned off his laptop, stood up, and walked toward the window. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. The man who had once believed in the strength of his marriage now stood at the crossroads of his own future. It would be painful, yes, but the future he imagined didn't include Lena, at least not the woman she had become. He needed to move on. The days following Chris's decision to confront Lena and take control of his life felt like a blur. The pain was still there, sharp and unrelenting, but there was something else now. An underlying sense of clarity, of direction. He had taken the first step, and that gave him a sliver of peace. Yet in the wake of his decision, everything changed. The world he had carefully built, the family structure he had always believed was invincible, was unraveling before him. Chris knew the emotional consequences would not just affect him. His children, too, were caught in the storm. That evening, after Lena left the house to stay with a friend, Chris gathered Josh and Emily in the living room. The weight of the conversation that was about to unfold sat heavily on his chest, but he had to do it. They had to know the truth. No more secrets. "Guys," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "There's something I need to tell you, about your mom and me." He paused, his throat tightening. "Things have been difficult between your mom and I for a while, and I'm sure you've noticed things aren't the same around here." Josh, his 17-year-old son, looked up from his phone, sensing the seriousness in his father's tone. Emily, still a bit younger at 14, turned her eyes to him, her brow furrowed. Chris took a deep breath. They deserved the truth, no matter how painful it would be. "Lena, your mom, she's been having an affair," Chris continued, his words slow, measured. "With someone from work." There was a beat of silence, the kind that felt as though the entire house was holding its breath. Josh's face went pale and Emily's eyes widened in disbelief. Neither of them knew how to respond. Both kids were stunned, their world shifted in an instant. "Dad, what does that mean?" Emily finally whispered, her voice breaking. Chris swallowed hard, fighting the lump in his throat. "It means your mom has been unfaithful, and things between us can't go back to the way they were. I don't want to go into the details, but I want you to understand that this isn't your fault. This is between your mom and me." Josh stood up, his expression hardening. "So you're getting a divorce?" Chris nodded, his eyes dark with the weight of the truth. "Yes, Josh. I'm not sure how things will work out yet, but I'm doing what's best for our family. You and Emily need to know that I love you both, and that won't change no matter what happens." Emily, who had always been the more emotional one, burst into tears. She ran to Chris, throwing her arms around him, her sobs muffled against his chest. He held her tight, trying to calm her, but inside he was falling apart too. His daughter's pain was almost unbearable. He hadn't wanted this for them. He hadn't wanted to hurt them like this. Josh stood silently, his eyes unreadable. He didn't cry, didn't shout. He just stood there, processing the news in his own way. Chris couldn't tell if his son was angry, sad, or just numb, but he knew that Josh had been deeply affected by the betrayal, perhaps even more so than Emily. Josh had been the one who had always been Chris's right-hand man, always by his side during family events, always asking about his work, always asking about life in general, and now that foundation had cracked. The conversation ended with no resolution, just a heavy silence as Chris tried to reassure them both. They went to their rooms, each retreating to their own corner of the house, trying to come to terms with the devastation. The days following the conversation with the kids were a mixture of quiet moments and chaotic bursts of emotions. Chris was caught in a whirlwind of legal meetings, therapy sessions, and his attempts to navigate this new reality. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, but the moments of personal growth began to emerge. He continued therapy with Dr. Julia Thomas, who had been guiding him through the emotional aspects of the divorce. She had helped him understand that this was not just about Lena's betrayal, it was about his own emotional neglect. Chris had always viewed himself as the strong provider, the man who worked hard to take care of everything, but now he saw how he had missed the small, everyday moments that mattered most, how Lena had felt neglected, how she had suffered in silence. "Chris," Dr. Thomas had said during one of their sessions, "you're focusing a lot on what Lena did. But now it's time to focus on you. What are you going to do with this newfound awareness of your own emotional needs? How will you grow from this?" The question had been a revelation. It was as if she had turned a mirror on him, forcing him to confront not just Lena's mistakes but his own. It was a painful truth to acknowledge, but Chris understood it now. He had neglected the emotional side of his marriage, and it had cost him. The next few weeks were a slow, painful process of self-discovery. Chris began to look inward, to confront his own flaws. He realized that just like Lena, he had sought refuge in work, in his career, in things that distracted him from his own vulnerabilities. Now those distractions were gone, and all that was left was him, the real him, without the facade of being the perfect husband or father. His children, too, were changing. Josh had become more distant, spending long hours at school or with friends, refusing to talk much about what was going on at home. But Chris could see the signs, the subtle shifts in Josh's mood, his quiet moments of reflection. He was hurting, too, but he wasn't yet ready to express it. Emily, on the other hand, had become more attached to Chris, spending time with him after school, helping with chores, and trying to fill the emotional void that Lena's absence had created. It was clear to Chris that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But there was one thing that had changed: his perspective. He had spent so much time trying to be the perfect provider that he had neglected the one thing that mattered most: his emotional connection with his family. He had let them down, and now it was time to rebuild, not just his marriage, but his relationship with his children and with himself. The days after Chris's initial legal consultation were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and the growing realization that the world he once knew was slipping through his fingers. Lena had been served with divorce papers, and the legal machinery was now in motion. Despite the emotional toll it had taken on him, Chris found a strange sense of control in the process. Each step he took felt like reclaiming something he had lost, like stitching together the remnants of his dignity. Chris had never imagined that his life would be defined by legal battles and the cold, unyielding language of contracts and custody agreements. He had always prided himself on being the protector of his family, someone who kept everything together, no matter the cost. But now, the very thing he had tried to hold together was being torn apart by a system that didn't care about emotions, didn't care about the love they once shared. All it cared about was what could be proven, what was in black and white. Lena, on the other hand, was fighting back. She wasn't ready to let go, not just of Chris, but of everything they had built together. The assets, the house, the life. It all seemed like a war zone to Chris. Her defiance was strong, and every move she made felt like a challenge, a reminder that she wasn't going to go quietly into the night, and that made it all the more difficult. The first battle came when Lena's lawyer, Stephen Lawson, filed for temporary custody of the children. It wasn't surprising. Chris knew that Lena would fight for the kids as any mother would, but the manner in which it was done, filing for a temporary restraining order against Chris, claiming he was a danger to the children emotionally, caught him off guard. Chris knew the accusation was baseless. He had never once raised his hand to Lena, and his relationship with Josh and Emily was solid. But the sting of the accusation, even though it was false, cut deep. Was Lena willing to go this far to win? In the following days, Chris met with his attorney, Catherine, to prepare for what would surely be a long and painful court battle. "They're going to do everything they can to paint you as the villain," Catherine said, her tone matter-of-fact but laced with an underlying sympathy. "They'll accuse you of being emotionally neglectful, of being absent. They'll use every opportunity to put you on the defensive. But you can't let that happen, Chris. You've been a good father, and the court will see that." Chris had always prided himself on being a good father, on providing for his children. But now, he had to prove it, in a way he never thought he'd have to. He spent hours organizing financial documents, proving the stability he had built for his family. He dug through old photos, messages, and texts, presenting a clear picture of his involvement in the kids' lives. Catherine helped him navigate the emotional minefield, making sure he stayed focused on the facts. "Don't get lost in the emotion, Chris," she reminded him. "You're in a battle, but it's not about who feels the worst. It's about what you can prove." As the days passed, Lena's defense became clearer. She leaned heavily on their history, emphasizing the emotional toll the divorce was taking on her and the children. She painted Chris as a man who had worked too much, a man who had ignored his wife's needs for years. And while some of her accusations hit closer to the truth than Chris wanted to admit, he couldn't let her manipulate the situation. He had been a good father, but he hadn't been the husband Lena needed. That was his failure, but it wasn't the whole truth. He had worked hard. He had been focused on providing, and perhaps, in doing so, he had neglected the emotional aspects of his marriage. But the affair wasn't his fault. That wasn't something he could accept as his responsibility. He would fight to the end for his kids, for his dignity. The legal battle soon extended beyond the custody of the children. Lena had hired a private investigator, hoping to find some way to undermine Chris's position. The investigator dug through Chris's past, searching for anything, any mistake, any misstep, that could be used against him. The investigator dug up an old credit card statement, one that showed a charge for a lavish dinner during a business trip. It was a gift for a client, a meal Chris had treated the client to after closing a deal. But Lena's lawyer took it and twisted it, presenting it as evidence of Chris's reckless spending and financial irresponsibility. Chris couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was the woman he had loved for nearly 2 decades, the woman he had worked so hard to support. And now she was using every weapon at her disposal to tear him apart. The power dynamic had shifted, and Chris was no longer the man in control of his own fate. The following week, Chris met with Catherine again, this time to go over the implications of Lena's claims. They'll try to twist every little detail, every piece of your life, to make you seem like the bad guy, Catherine said, her voice filled with determination. But we'll fight back. You're not going to lose this. Chris felt the weight of the situation pressed down on him, but Catherine's words gave him the strength to keep going. This was about more than just the assets or the children. It was about his dignity. And Chris wasn't about to let Lena or anyone else take that from him. As the days dragged on, Chris felt himself becoming more isolated. The tension between him and Lena was palpable, and every interaction with her felt like a battlefield. But he no longer cared. He was done with the lies, done with the games. Now, he was focused on securing a future for himself and his children, one where they could heal, one where they could grow beyond the pain of this divorce. Chris knew this would be a long and hard fight, but for the first time in a long time, he felt empowered. The emotional weight of betrayal still hung over him, but he had reclaimed control. Now he would fight, not just for what was rightfully his, but for the future he wanted to build. The weeks following Chris's legal meeting were filled with a constant tension, a tightrope walk between hope and dread. Each day, Chris walked into his home, a place that once felt like his sanctuary, and now it was nothing more than a battleground. Lena's accusations, her manipulation of the legal system, and the mounting emotional strain had taken their toll. But the worst part was yet to come. The truth, as it often does, had been hidden, safely tucked away, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And that moment arrived one cold Wednesday afternoon when Chris's world shifted again. It was David, the private investigator, who first brought it to his attention. "Chris, I've been digging into some of Lena's financials," David said over the phone, his voice carrying a tone that Chris couldn't quite place. It wasn't the usual straightforward delivery he was accustomed to. This sounded serious. "There's something you need to see." Chris's pulse quickened. The battle over their assets was already complex, but now David had found something. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he listened. David hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "It's about the house. You know how you've been paying the mortgage, right? Well, I looked into her accounts, into her secret accounts. There's been a series of unexplained transfers, large ones. It seems like Lena's been siphoning off more money than you realize, Chris." Chris felt a chill run down his spine. Was this another manipulation, another attempt to leave him with nothing? Or was it something more? "What are you talking about, David? Where is this money going?" "I don't have all the details yet, but there are payments to a private account, to someone named Ryan Foster." The world stopped for a moment. Chris felt his blood run cold, his fists clenched so tight they hurt. The man who had already taken so much from him, Ryan Foster, was now taking more. And Lena had helped him. The house, their home, the symbol of their life together, had been used as a pawn in a larger scheme. Chris wasn't just fighting for his marriage and his children. He was now fighting for his financial security, for everything he had worked so hard to provide. But as the details of this new betrayal sank in, he realized the magnitude of the game that had been played behind his back. That evening, Chris stood in front of Lena. His breath was heavy, his pulse still racing from the revelation. He had waited too long to confront her. This was the moment, the point of no return. He couldn't play games anymore. "Lena," Chris began, his voice low and firm, "we need to talk about the house." Lena, who had been pacing nervously in their living room, stopped and turned to face him. "What about it?" Chris didn't waste time. "I know about the transfers. I know about the accounts you've been hiding from me." He paused, watching her face for a reaction. Her eyes flickered for a moment. Guilt, fear, something he couldn't place. "And I know that you've been funneling money to Ryan. You've been using our home to cover it up." Lena's face turned pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Chris continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. Why, Lena, why would you do this? Why would you take everything from me, from us? For a moment it looked as if she would collapse, as though the weight of the truth was finally too much to bear. She dropped her head, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't want you to know, Chris. I thought it would be easier if you didn't. I was ashamed. She wiped at her eyes, a few sobs escaping. But it's not what you think. I wasn't just giving him money, I was paying him back for what he did for us. Chris felt his world tilt. Paying him back? For what? What could he possibly have done for you that would justify this? Lena took a deep breath, her voice shaking as she finally revealed what had been hidden all along. Chris, I didn't just have an affair with Ryan. I'm in love with him. I have been for months, and when you were so distant, so focused on work, I reached out to him. He helped me. She stopped, unable to continue, but Chris had heard enough. The shock hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just the betrayal of a husband and wife, it was a deeper, more personal wound. Lena hadn't just fallen out of love with him, she had fallen in love with someone else, someone who had been there for her emotionally when Chris wasn't. You're telling me that all this time I've been fighting for a marriage that you were already checked out of? Chris's voice cracked with anger and disbelief. And now you've been sneaking around, lying about money, about everything, all while I've been doing my best to keep our family together? Lena nodded slowly. Her shoulders slumped as though the weight of her confession was finally too much for her to carry. I'm sorry, Chris. I never meant to hurt you, but I couldn't keep living a lie. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Chris stood frozen, his mind reeling from the new truth, the weight of what had been uncovered. Everything he thought he knew, everything he had built, had been a facade. This wasn't just about his failure as a husband. This was a full-scale betrayal that shook the very foundation of everything they had built together. The days that followed were filled with tension and disbelief. The legal battle intensified, with new revelations coming to light. Lena's hidden accounts were just the beginning. There were more secrets, more lies, and as Chris worked with his attorney to uncover the full scope of Lena's deception, he realized how far she had gone to manipulate the situation. But there was one thing Chris knew for sure. He couldn't let this break him. He had been broken before, but now he had a choice. He could rise from the ashes, stronger than ever. As the investigation into Lena's finances continued, Chris made sure to stay focused, not on the destruction, but on the reconstruction. His future wasn't in the past. It was in the choices he made now. The weeks after the revelations about Lena's betrayal were nothing short of a storm. Every conversation, every meeting with lawyers or therapists seemed to only push Chris further into a deep well of reflection. The house, once a place of love and laughter, now echoed with a haunting emptiness. Each room seemed to bear the weight of broken promises. But amid the emotional chaos there was something else, a new understanding, a flicker of hope that, despite everything, healing was still possible. It wasn't an easy process. Healing rarely was. Chris spent his days at work, focusing on tasks that required no emotional input, but the nights were the hardest. The silence in the house was deafening, and there were moments when the pain of what Lena had done seemed too much to bear. He had felt betrayed on so many levels, not just the affair, but the deception, the way she had pushed him away emotionally and turned to someone else for comfort. But one evening after a long day, Chris came to a realization that shifted his perspective. It wasn't about seeking revenge or holding on to the hurt. It wasn't about destroying Lena or fighting for something that had already crumbled. It was about moving forward, about reclaiming his own life and finding peace in the wake of the storm. Chris had been working with Dr. Julia Thomas for several months now, attending therapy sessions that helped him unpack the emotional debris of his marriage. During one session, Julia asked him a simple yet profound question. "Chris, what would it look like for you to truly heal from this?" He had paused at her question, unsure how to answer. For so long, healing had felt like an impossible concept, something distant and out of reach. But as he thought about it more, he realized that healing wasn't about forgetting or pretending the pain didn't exist. It was about acknowledging the hurt, accepting it, and then choosing to let go of the anger and resentment that had been holding him back. "You can't change the past," Julia had said, "but you can choose how you move forward. Healing starts when you make the choice to let go of what no longer serves you." Those words stayed with him, resonating deeply as he sat in his kitchen late one evening. He had spent so many months trying to control the outcome of the divorce, trying to understand Lena's actions, trying to fix what was broken. But the truth was, he couldn't fix her and he couldn't fix the past. What he could do was choose to heal, for himself and for his children. The next day, Chris made a decision that surprised even him. He would let go. He wasn't going to let the anger and resentment consume him any longer. It was time to stop clinging to the idea of what his marriage could have been and start focusing on what his life could be without it. That afternoon, Chris sat down with Lena for the first time since their confrontation about the affair. The tension was palpable as she entered the room, her face pale, eyes tired from weeks of sleepless nights. She sat down opposite him, the space between them thick with unspoken words. "Lena," Chris began, his voice steady but softer than he had imagined it would be. "I've been holding on to a lot of anger, but I realize now that it's only hurting me. I can't move forward until I let go of all of this." Lena looked up, her face a mixture of relief and regret. "Chris, I'm sorry for everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I can never undo what I've done, but I want you to know that I am truly sorry. I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to explain. I was lost, and I didn't know how to fix it. I still don't." Chris nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He didn't need her apology to heal. He had come to understand that the real healing came from within himself. "I don't need you to fix anything, Lena," Chris replied, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in months. "I just need to heal, and for that I need to let go of the anger. For me, not for you." The conversation wasn't perfect. There were still raw emotions between them, and there were moments when the old wounds reopened. But for the first time, Chris felt a sense of peace. He wasn't holding on to the past anymore. He wasn't dragging the weight of their failed marriage with him every step of the way. A few days later, Chris took a step that solidified his commitment to healing. He took a long walk through their neighborhood, something he hadn't done in years. As he walked, he allowed himself to reflect, not on the hurt or the betrayal, but on the moments that still brought him joy. He thought about the laughter he'd shared with his kids, the small victories in his career, the friendships that had sustained him. He thought about who he was outside of the pain and the drama of the divorce. As the sun began to set, Chris found himself at the small park near their house, the same park where he had taken Josh and Emily when they were young, where he had once dreamed of a future that felt so secure and full of promise. Now it was just a place, a reminder of what had been, but also of what was yet to come. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time he felt that he could breathe again. The future wasn't an empty space anymore. He would rebuild, not just his life, but his sense of self. Later that evening, Chris sat down with Josh and Emily for dinner. The air in the house was different, lighter somehow. Josh wasn't as distant as he had been, and Emily smiled more freely. There was still pain, still confusion, but there was also the faintest glimmer of something more, something stronger than the devastation they had all felt. Chris had no illusions that everything was healed. Healing took time. It was a process, not a moment. But he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer a man defined by his past. He was becoming the man he wanted to be, for himself and for his children. And that was enough. The weeks after Chris had made peace with the past and fully embraced his commitment to healing were transformative. The house, though still bearing the weight of the memories of a fractured marriage, felt different. It was as though a subtle shift had taken place, like the first rays of sunlight pushing through a long, dark storm. Chris didn't have the answers to everything, but he had made a choice, and in that choice, he had started to rebuild, piece by piece. The emotional storm had not completely passed, but for the first time in a long while, Chris felt a sense of control. He had taken the reins of his life again, not defined by Lena's betrayal, not weighed down by the anger that had once consumed him. He understood now that the future wasn't something to fear, but something to build. Slowly, carefully, with intention. One of the hardest lessons Chris had learned was that he couldn't fix the past, but he could shape the future. And it started with small steps, taking time for himself, reconnecting with his children, and finding his purpose again. He had spent years lost in the pursuit of success, but now he was rediscovering the joy in life's simpler moments. Chris knew the most important relationships in his life, his children, were still fragile. He had spent the better part of his marriage focused on providing for them, on making sure they had everything they needed. But now, he knew that what they needed most was his emotional presence, his attention. It was time to rebuild the bond that had been strained over the last few months. One Saturday afternoon, Chris decided to take Josh and Emily out for lunch. The idea was simple: no distractions, no phones, just a chance to talk and reconnect. They went to a local cafe, their usual spot, where the three of them had spent countless weekends over the years. As they sat around the table, the conversation started slowly. But as they dug deeper, the walls began to come down. Josh, who had been withdrawn for so long, shared his thoughts about what had been happening at home. He wasn't angry anymore, not like he had been, but there was still a sadness in his eyes, a grief that Chris couldn't ignore. "I guess I was just confused, Dad," Josh admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't know what was happening and I didn't know how to handle it. I thought, maybe you didn't care about us anymore." Chris felt his heart break at the words. He had always tried to protect them from the darker side of things, but in doing so he had failed to see their pain. "I'm sorry, Josh," Chris said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I should have been there more. I was so caught up in everything else that I missed what was happening right in front of me." Emily, who had been quiet, spoke up. "I get it, Dad. It's been hard on all of us, but we're still a family. We'll get through this together." For the first time in a long while, Chris felt a lightness. The conversation, though painful, was the first step toward healing. They were talking again. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that's what mattered. The next few weeks were a period of self-reflection and growth. Chris continued his therapy sessions with Dr. Thomas, using the time to unpack deeper layers of his emotions. He understood now that his marriage had been a mirror of his own failings. The relationship with Lena hadn't fallen apart because of her actions alone. It had deteriorated because of his inability to truly see her, to connect with her on an emotional level. "I've learned that healing is not a straight line," Chris admitted to Dr. Thomas during one of their sessions. "It's more like a dance, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I'm okay with that. I've accepted that this process will take time, and that's fine." Dr. Thomas smiled, nodding in agreement. "That's a healthy perspective, Chris. Acknowledging that the road ahead will be bumpy is part of the healing process. But you're doing the work. That's what matters." Chris left the office that day feeling lighter, more focused. He wasn't the man he had been before, the one lost in anger and hurt, but he was becoming the man he wanted to be, the man who could accept his mistakes and grow from them. It was a freeing realization, one that gave him the courage to face the future. Months passed and Chris continued to grow stronger in his resolve. He made new plans, started thinking about what his life would look like beyond the divorce. He reconnected with old friends, re-established hobbies he had once loved, and began to prioritize his health, both physical and emotional. There were still difficult days, of course. There were days when the weight of the past felt unbearable, when the memories of Lena's betrayal crept into his mind like a shadow. But Chris was learning to let those moments pass, to acknowledge the pain without letting it control him. He also worked through the intricacies of co-parenting with Lena. They had established a routine for the kids, something stable, something normal for them. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, moments when Chris wanted to lash out, to remind Lena of the pain she had caused. But he held back, understanding that the ultimate goal was peace for Josh and Emily. They deserved that. One afternoon, as Chris sat in his backyard watching Josh and Emily play in the yard, he realized something profound. The future was not something to fear anymore. It was something to embrace. His life, though scarred, was still full of possibility. It was a few months later, after everything had settled into a new routine, that Chris found himself looking ahead with a newfound optimism. He wasn't naive. He knew there would be more challenges to face, more struggles ahead. But he also knew that he had the strength to handle them. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Chris was no longer afraid of it. He had learned to embrace change, to let go of what couldn't be fixed, and to focus on what he could control. Most importantly, he had learned to love himself again, not in spite of his failures, but because of them. As the days grew warmer, Chris smiled to himself. He had been through the fire, and though he had been scorched, he had emerged stronger. The chapter with Lena had closed and a new one was just beginning. The future was waiting, and Chris was ready for it. Whether it's betrayal, loss, or failure, we all have the power to rebuild and create a future that reflects who we want to be. And sometimes, letting go is the first step toward healing. But remember, healing isn't linear. It takes time, patience, and self-compassion. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Have you ever faced a moment of betrayal in your life? How did you find the strength to move forward? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. Also, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more heartwarming tales in the future. Where are you watching from? I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Let's connect and build a community. Thanks for watching, and remember, no matter what you're going through, you're never alone on this journey. Stay strong, stay hopeful, and keep moving forward.